The early years of your life have an everlasting impact upon you, and this is true for the man that became Iago Sevatarian. Like many of the Astartes of the Night Lord's 8th Legion, his home was Nostramo, a hive world perpetually dark due to its pollution-clogged atmosphere and the fact that it was circled by a slowly dying star whose light was unable to penetrate this fog and reach the surface. The humans of this world are easily identifiable by their pale skin and pitch-black eyes suited to the environment without light. Only the wealthy could afford the Nostraman idea of illumination, leaving the rest of their populace to bathe in the world's darkness. Luckily, the geology of Nostramo was nothing short of priceless, as the world's unusual crust had unprecedented amounts of the naturally occurring adamantium. The presence of such abundant qualities of this valuable metal meant that the cities of Nostramo enjoyed a very profitable commerce with their neighbouring worlds. The vast majority of the planet's people worked as labourers, whilst the brutal and cruel wealthy watched from their towers. The word untouchable could never be more appropriate to the nobility of Nostramo, who ruled with an iron fist. This world had only 5 major hive cities, named in sequence from Nostramo Prime to Nostramo Quintus. Each of these cities' hubs and surrounding regions were scarred with foundries and refineries, as each hive city was shaped and moulded behind this single resource, an only true source of relevance in the galaxy. These dark cities were easily identifiable by the mile-high smokestacks that bloomed up at the perpetual night, continuing to add to the pollution-clogged atmosphere that blocked any chance of recovery. Inside these gothic hive cities, there were mazes of bridges with narrow alleys and poorly lit streets. The further down one descended into the denizens' packed layers, the more destitute and lawless it became. If the absence of warmth and a bright sun was not enough, even the atmosphere on the surface was a thick smog. Dust, smoke and the reek of chemicals filled the air and worked into the flesh of every man, woman and child, diminishing away the years so that the best of their life could offer was a slow decline. All while working a back-breaking job in the countless foundries, most directly next to the source of their own ill health. Compounding the never-ending darkness and vile atmosphere was the absolute poverty that the majority of the world lived in. The destitute pay in the foundries and the mines was combined with the poor availability of basic necessities such as clean food and water. Murder, theft and extortion was integral in Nostraman society. Especially within the lower levels, it was, in reality, a constant battle for survival. Taking from others, eliminating rivals or threats, was the only way to keep those who you cared for alive. The only sense of justice was in the hands of the individual, though heavily deterred by the underhive gangs and private thugs. A destitute existence, likely preyed upon by the rampant criminal gangs and a corrupt governing aristocracy. Compared to the silver spoon of the nobility, the average Nostraman was born with a knife in their hand, ready to do what was necessary. Most having to choose affiliation with the hive gangs just to get by. With all of these horrifying factors that made up daily life, it resulted in the most heartbreaking of truths. The population's numbers of Nostramo were not kept down by war, sickness or murder, but in reality, self-erasure. No joy, happiness or warmth reached a majority of the people of Nostramo. A life with no future, destined to be corrupted by sickness or murdered. A place many would consider a good representation of a cold, dark hell. It would be at the edge of Nostromo Quintus where the boy Iago Civitarien was born. Adapting to this brutal world meant learning to survive amongst the gangs and thieves that ruled the streets. For those who knew him even as a young boy, he was known for his arrogance. Part of the problem was that he was so rarely wrong. Was he born lucky? Or underneath his pale and cold exterior, he was just intuitive? Constantly to be right made it hard for him to take other people's opinions and observations seriously. His mother told him that he would grow out of it, that he would become better with people. Despite living in a literal hellhole, it seems that even as a youth he desired connection and a bond with others. And perhaps an opportunity had come for this talented, ruthless young Nostraman boy. I believe it was during his youth that the world of Nostromo saw the rise of the ruthless vigilante known as Night Haunter. It was the Primarch Konrad Curze that over the years began ravaging the streets of Nostromo, brutally torturing any person who dared to commit a crime. This Night Haunter had become an object of fear and hate within the city. Finally appearing before the nobles that had survived his vigilante purge, the Night Haunter became the first monarch of Nostromo. For the first time in living memory, Nostromo had some version of fair and temperate rule. Until the word of some injustice had reached his ears, he would then hunt the guilty through the streets, wearing them down and then killing and mutilating them. This unpredictable pattern of benevolent wisdom and hideous vengeance ushered in a new level of efficiency and honesty the world had never seen before. Other cities around the planet followed suit quickly, in an attempt to keep the Night Haunter from their doors. Within a lifetime, Iago Civitarien's world had changed, though this new world of peace and honesty would not be his home for much longer. Everything had changed on Nostromo with the coming of the Emperor of Mankind. As he landed on Nostromo and led an imperial delegation to the centre of Nostromo Quintus, the citizens of Nostromo, adapted to their near constant darkness, could not bear to look upon the radiance of the Emperor of Mankind. Most wept as the healing light he projected reflected off the rain-slicked streets into their faces. Those brave enough to look upon him directly were blinded. At the end of the broad road leading to the Night Haunter's royal palace, the Primarch stood, waiting for the delegation to approach. And with the meeting of Konrad Curze and the Emperor, the world of Nostromo joined the growing Imperium of Man. Like with many Primarchs before, their homeworld became the new recruits for their own legion of superhuman warriors, the Legiones Astartes. For an entire generation, including the young boy Iago Civitarien, they would be selected to join the 8th Legion, the Night Lords. The 8th Legion, even before reunifying with their Primarch, conjured feelings of fear and dread. Even in their origins, the Legion's first recruits came from underground prisons and gulags, condemned to never see light again or breathe free air. They lived out their lives in fear and blind darkness. There was no law in these lightless prisons, and survival existed only by the blade. Only the most strongest and most ruthless survived in these subterranean warrens, and those who did grew in the cruelty and the cunning that surrounded them. Fed by a constant influx from the high cities above, the prison sinks were an entire epicenter of madness and murder. Amongst the bloodshed and fear, children were born. Cradled in the dark and raised amongst death, those who lived over a standard decade were pale, silent creatures who had adapted to the darkness and mutated with their conditions. They were nicknamed the Night Children, and even the most savage killers on Terra would not seek them out by choice. It was from these pale, dark children that the Emperor of Mankind would create the first warriors of the 8th Legion. People from all walks of life have talents and uses, something the Emperor clearly understood. The gene seed of the 8th Legion had been well paired with the human stock of its first recruits, and if anything, it seemed as if one had been made with the other in mind. Besides accentuating their paleness of their skin, the gene seed gave the sons of this underworld the ability to see through the darkness to a degree far exceeded that of the other Astartes of legions. This gift was also a curse, forcing them to see the light of suns and stars through filters and flare buffers. Even though now that they walked in the light of the world above, the warriors of the 8th Legion were always sons born in the dark, crafted into men in the dark. So why has the Emperor chosen these pale murderers to be representing a force in the galaxy? I believe it was for the simple idea that some people could not be reasoned with. He gave the 8th Legion the role of bringing those to heel whose sins of the past could not live on in this newborn Imperium of Man, when such crimes required not simply crushing, but retribution. The Emperor deployed his 8th Legion. Such action seemed well suited to the 8th Legion, whether as a consequence of their genetic inheritance or a combination of their origins and indoctrination. The warriors of the 8th Legion seemed to have tended to bend their morals to deliver the Emperor's justice. There were no shades of grey in the 8th Legion's moral universe, no degrees of guilt or innocence. This retribution was delivered cruelly and unquestionably, for the Emperor of Mankind had taken these thieves and murderers and raised them up to be gene-enhanced warriors. They would have to be willing to do the dark and evil things that others wouldn't have the stomach for. The warriors of the 8th Legion were creatures made to live in the dark and to fight for a war in a future of light. In their core, they were warriors, fighting for a future that would have no place for their kind. This mindset has often been the extremely contentious philosophy even throughout human history. Even in our own world, the culture and inspiration for this legion's doctrine reflects the infamous Vlad Tepes. During the Middle Ages, this Wallachian voivode, during his rule, committed brutal atrocities to his enemies. His fondness for impaling his enemies on stakes in the ground and leaving them to die earned him the name Vlad the Impaler. He inflicted this type of torture on foreign and domestic enemies alike. Notably, as he retreated from battle, he left fields filled with thousands of impaled victims for the pursuing Ottoman forces, using overwhelming fear and dread to cower his enemies, breaking them apart psychologically piece by piece. He gave those who stood in his way his vision of the perfect future, the justice he felt they deserved, and added that suits the Primarch Conrad Kurz and the Night Lord's Legion perfectly. Yargo Sevatarian and many of his newly recruited Nostramians' life had reflected much of the 8th Legion, and now he and his brothers, who like the Legion were born in the darkness, set out to conquer the galaxy in the Emperor's name, immersed in the tactics and culture of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords. Nostramo and its citizens had joined the Imperium of Man, uniting with the burgeoning human empire, and the new recruits from this world began to fill the ranks of the 8th Legion. Much like with many legions, the reunification with their Primarch would begin a shift in culture and tactics dictated by this new leadership. For the 8th Legion, they were taken over by Konrad Curze. The Night Haunter quickly adapted to the teachings of the Imperium, studying the complex doctrines of the Legiones Astartes under Fulgrim, Primarch of the Third Emperor's Children, who was renowned amongst his brothers for achieving perfection in every facet of life. Konrad was soon accepted as the leader of the 8th Space Marine Legion that had been created from his own gene seed, which he had renamed the Night Lords. Although he and his legion excelled in many theatres of war, they began to perfect a unique art of war. Under the tutelage and doctrine of the Emperor, this brutal legion had excelled in delivering swift, merciless justice to traitors and enemies. But something had begun to change. Over the first few years, the Night Lords were moulded by their Primarch into an efficient, humorless force of zealots. Konrad encouraged his legion to decorate their power armour with the images designed to inspire fear in their enemies, a tactic that proved incredibly effective. Gone was the swiftness of a crushing defeat, replaced by the slow bleeding war of annihilation and psychological horror, just as how the Night Haunter had brought his homeworld of Nostromo into complete, unflinching compliance. Soon rumours of an impending presence of the Night Lords would cause a rebel star system to pay all outstanding Imperial tithes, cease all illegal activities, and put to death any mutants and suspected traitors. The reuniting of the Primarch and Legion was the beginning of a spiral that would see the Night Lords descend further into horror and nihilism. But why would this barbaric warfare be allowed within the Great Crusade? Because for every non-compliant world with a small number of rebels or enemies that were butchered or tortured beyond human limits, thousands of worlds that had heard these atrocities would not dare rise up and suffer the same fate, thus sparing the million or so who would have died in a war, disease, or starvation that would have come to them. People were not happy, but they were alive, dissuaded by the infamy of this cruel, punishing force. It was this new legion that Iago Sevatarian was trained in. From the previously edge of a hive city to a legion filled with many cruel warriors. Perhaps this indoctrination and tactics began to poison the legion, twisting its purpose and making many Night Lords simple murderers, gifted with the strength of demigods. For Iago and his fellow brothers, these tactics came directly from their Primarch, the son of the Emperor of Mankind. With his cold upbringing on Nostromo, this was all Konrad knew. He had committed heinous acts and atrocities in the name of peace, and now so would his sons. Ironically, it was the figure of the Night Haunter that punished murderers and criminals, and now he had moulded an entire legion of them. Over the years of the Great Crusade, it is clear that he came to despise his own genetic sons, but he was still their lord. Far from restraining the 8th Legion, he drove it on, bringing peace through atrocity to planet after planet. Perhaps sometimes there seems to have been cause for such methods, and others it had not. After repeating these atrocities on countless worlds, it had become clear that for Iago and the Night Lords, they were beginning to enjoy it. They had become not necessary monsters, but simply monsters. Curze quickly began to lose some of the control he had over his legion's innate savagery. They were becoming increasingly desensitized to things that would have scarred and shocked us to the very bone. With this perversion of this Terran-born 8th Legion, they were matched in depravity by the Nostraman-born recruits. Even amongst his brothers, Iago Sevatarian was known as a brutal and arrogant man. Even as a child, he always seemed to be right, and with the pairing of the Primarch's gene seed, this ability only increased. Amongst the new recruits, he proved extremely gifted and supremely ruthless, even a dishonourable combatant. Even upon entering this brotherhood, he was struck with the same problem he had felt his entire life: establishing connections. Iago had no friends or brothers in the Legion, just fellow warriors. His interactions with everyone were sarcastic and deprecating because perhaps he didn't really care what they thought of him. Ironically, it was his unflinching smugness combined with the battle prowess that led many of the savage Night Lords to reluctantly appreciate and like him. They were all demigod killers, so they were clearly respecting this cunning and brutal Astartes. And he had not gone unnoticed, and began a meteoric rise through the ranks of the Night Lords. Even standing out amongst the Night Lords must have meant that he had done awful things, deeds enough to earn him infamy amongst this brutal legion. As the years of the Great Crusade progressed, Iago Sevatarian joined the ranks of the Chiroptera, the Primarch's most trusted advisors. As he served the Primarchs directly, he had now proven himself not just to the Legion, but to Konrad. There was no question that there was none more deadly, more cunning, and surprisingly more loyal. After decades in the Legion, Iago Sevatarian became the first captain, Sevatar of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords. Tiago, what would come to define and alter much of his life, is the bond he had with his gene father, the Night Haunter Konrad Curze. To all the Legiones Astartes, their Primarch was the reason for their transformation, their leader, and in some way a surrogate father figure that they would strive to impress and live up to. With Iago being elevated to the rank of first captain, he and a selected few became advisors to the deeply troubled Primarch of the 8th Legion. Over the continuing years of the Great Crusade, this bond between them would only strengthen as Konrad began to confide more in his first captain, likely not fearing judgment from the equally cruel and depraved warrior. This degradation for the Primarch and the whole Legion was not going unnoticed, and many of the other legions and Primarchs decried the actions of the Night Lords. Curze even stated that he did not hate any of his brothers, save Corax. The two were extremely similar in their appearance, tactics, and upbringing, but unlike him, Corax had retained his humanity and dignity despite his hellish upbringing. Curze himself did not know if he hated Corax out of self-loathing, or the fact that he saw the Raven Lord as still holding on to naive ideals despite his upbringing. For his part, Corax stated that he hated nothing about Curze, save his methods of waging war. During the Carnine Retribution, these two Primarchs almost came to blows, unable to reconcile the differences in ideals. It was now that we see Iago had somewhat of a calming influence over Curze, convincing him to withdraw a standoff with Corax and his Raven Guard. Only one other person in the entire galaxy, the Emperor, had ever managed to reason directly with Curze. Perhaps we could never call this friendship, but there is clearly a level of trust that Iago and Konrad have, one that even the lonely Primarch never had with his brothers. Struggling to establish bonds between brothers is something that Iago himself struggled with too, a struggle that became apparent when he had duelled Sigismund of the Imperial Fists, the only warrior to ever beat him to a deadlock in over 100 standard years of warfare. The duel had lasted almost 30 long solar hours, sweat, swearing, and a clash of iron against iron. Iago managed to finish the duel by headbutting the Templar, using the Night Lord's methods of victory at any cost, but unfortunately disqualifying himself. It broke the rules, as well as Sigismund's winning streak. True to his nature, Sigismund had done nothing but laugh. taking the lose in stride and sharing that moment with his brothers and friends. Iago was an immensely skilled warrior, enough to beat one of the most skilled duelists in the entire Imperium. But he envied Sigismund for so effortlessly bonding with all those around him. Iago, like Sigismund, is a cut above most other Space Marines, but like his Primarch, he again continues to fail to establish a sense of brotherhood. He was sarcastic, deadly, arrogant, and annoyingly always right. This Machiavellian attitude in the face of danger had made many of the Legion admire and respect him, but the cost of seeming unapproachable and subsequently feared. Like many of the Primarchs, he may have wished to be more normal, to be amongst equals. But Iago was special, and held a secret that was the roots of his problems. A secret that only his Primarch knew, the first time that they had met. When the Emperor passed his decree following the Council of Nicaea, the Night Lord's Terran-born Chief Librarian Zarost sought a private audience with Iago, who had been left in temporary command of the Night Lords in their Primarch's absence. He demanded that Iago give the Emperor's judgment against the Legion's Librarius, and against him. To be given orders by one beneath him enraged Iago, and he leapt upon Zarost and struck him in the chest, knocking the Chief Librarian to the chamber floor. He then rendered his judgment that Zarost was cast out. He would no longer be of the 8th Legion and was condemned to death should they ever meet again. As Zarost made to leave, he tried to argue with Iago that the Legion had stood for something once. The first captain rolled his eyes and dismissively waved the former Chief Librarian away. Before he could stop himself, Zarost's rage got the better of him, and he summoned forth his innate psychic abilities. Before he was even aware that he had lost control, he had used his powers to slam the first captain with a wave of energy into the Primarch's command throne. As he slammed Sevatar's head into the throne, he angrily cursed the first captain and his debased Nostraman brothers for tarnishing the 8th Legion. But before he could continue, Iago activated his own hidden psychic abilities to strike back at Zarost. All this time, from the young arrogant boy on Nostramo who'd always seemed to be right, he was in reality a psyker. Iago had long repressed these abilities, which were more often used subconsciously rather than his direct will. His powers made him different as an Astartes, especially in combat. He did not quite understand how it was possible, but he was able to run faster and tire more slowly than most of his enemies. His psychic abilities gave him the edge to stand out amongst his brothers, but were indirectly the cause of his loneliness and distance from them. In the eyes of the Night Lords, he became this untouchable warrior who had left countless bodies in his wake, feeding the dirt and the scavengers of battlefields. He became the Prince of Crows. The Great Crusade had progressed for over 200 years, and the 8th Legion barely resembled the Terran forces that had departed to conquer the galaxy for the Emperor. With the integration of the Night Haunter's tactics of psychological warfare and the influx of recruits from Nostramo, the Legion had become a disdained band of murderers in their fellow Legion's eyes. The effect of Iago and the Legion committing atrocities regularly had the disheartening effect of making them numb to it. In fact, the very cruel act that they had punished in others, they came to enjoy, turning into more twisted sport or a disgusting craft. In fact, Iago and many of the other Night Lords wore flayed skin of the innocent victims in accordance with the imagery of fear their Primarch encouraged. They waged war in a way that spared many from death, but for those in their sights, the release of death was a gift. They were condemned by many of the Primarchs, who were disgusted by the way the Night Haunter and his legion waged war. The words people use to describe you have more meaning than you would think. For if the Night Lords were called thieves, murderers and cruel, what reason would they have to try and be better if the world had condemned them to this box? Unfortunately, the Night Haunter's psyche in these latter years was continuing to decline, despite the close counsel of Yargo and the Crypteria. It must have been disheartening for Yargo to see his Primarch crumble and suffer like this. But he was his lord, his father, and he stood by his side for over a century. When the Night Lords received news of their homeworld Nostromo falling back into its volatile and corrupt ways, Yargo, knowing his Primarch so well, likely saw how Conrad would take this. Kurz then returned to Nostromo with the Night Lord's legion in full, ready to give the world the justice they deserved. He destroyed the Dark World utterly, with orbitable fire from his fleets that cracked through the world's crust and destabilized its volatile core, cracking it open in like an egg until only fragments remained drifting in the void. Kurz viewed this atrocity as a rightful punishment for his homeworld's return to its corrupt ways during his long absence on the Great Crusade. This world had never accepted or loved him, and that had formed him into the Night Haunter and filled his legion's ranks with the debased and cruel recruits. Yargo and many of the Nostroman Night Lords had become desensitized killers, and their twisted sense of loyalty was to the Night Lords and no one else. But not all could just willingly accept the destruction of their imperial planet or their homeworld, and mutinies began to flare up during the fleet's bombardment. For those who would not fall in line, Sevatar and his Atramentar brutally put them down, teleporting from ship to ship and fighting their own Astartes brothers in brutal ways that would strike fear in the hearts of anyone else who had the courage to rebel. With the destruction of their homeworld and the ostracization from most of the Imperium, all the Legion had left was each other. Chastised, desensitized, and unrewarded for the victories that the Legion had brought to the Emperor and the Imperium, Yargo and the Night Lords were at the point of their greatest discontent, where they were met with an offer. Lorgar Aurelian of the Word Bearers spoke of the Emperor's lies about faith in the gods, and his plans for eradication of the Adeptus Astartes at the end of the Great Crusade. That possibly a better future could be under the War Master Horus, the rightful second Emperor of mankind, the true Emperor, one who would reward the brave warriors of the Imperium. When Lorgar had finished speaking, the first Captain Sevatar was the first to declare, "Death to the false Emperor." And in doing so, he became the first living soul to utter those words that would echo throughout the millennia. The cry was taken up by other voices, and soon it was roared across all the traitorous legions, and the dark betrayal of Istvan was conceived. Such was the standard of depravity and sense of independence that the 8th Legion had no need to even purge part of the Legion in preparation for this betrayal. With the denouncement of Horus, the Emperor tasked 7 whole Space Marine legions to bring that traitor to justice. As the Night Lords deployed, First Captain Sevatar led his first company elites, the Atramentar, to the surface upon Isfahan 5. They eagerly awaited the withdrawing loyalists on the slopes of the Urgol Depression. The battered black armour of the Raven Guard warriors came towards the unified Night Lords and Wordbearers force. After a moment of chilling silence, Yargo and the other Night Lords and traitors unleashed their bolters, engaging the wounded and battled loyalists. During the ensuing chaos of battle, the Gal Vorbrak of the Wordbearers Legion revealed that they were demon hosts for the denizens of the Warp. Their flesh and ceramite had fused and warped into a new bestial form, making them out as amongst the first of the possessed Chaos Space Marines. To Yago, I think he always felt like a monster on the inside, but these Marines were possessed, real physical abominations, enhanced by foul denizens of the warp, rather than their own strength. After the battle, when Lorgar's favoured son, Argol Tal, approached Sevatar to congratulate him on his victory, the first captain removed his helm and spat on the ground by the word-bearer's feet. Sevatar's attitude was openly hostile to the word-bearers. Was this the future Lorgar had spoken about? Had he fought for over a century, tortured innocents and even destroyed his homeworld for them? Whose future and purpose was he really fighting for now? Following the massacre upon Isfahan V, the Warmaster sent Nighthaunter and his Night Lord's Legion on a campaign of genocide against the Imperial strongholds of the Herolda and Thramus in the Aegeus subsect of the Eastern Fringes, thus protecting Horus's flank and delaying the Dark Angel's Legion from reinforcing the Loyalists. This brutal, contested campaign, known as the Thramus Crusade, dragged on for nearly 3 standard years. After countless engagements over a year, a parley was called, and the Primarchs were accompanied by 2 warriors from their personal honour guards. Sevatar was one of the representatives of the Night Lords, and when the Lion arrived at the meeting site, he was flanked by his own honour guard, Master Alajos and Paladin Corswain. When the honour guards gathered, the words spoken were unpleasant and rang with Sevatar's famous sarcasm. During this unpleasant conversation, Corswain noticed Sevatar's gauntlets. They were painted arterial red. Sevatar explained that it was a mark of shame within the 8th Legion. A warrior's gauntlets were marked this way when he had failed the Primarch gravely enough to warrant death. He would wear the stain of his failure upon his hands until his execution, upon the hour of the Primarch's choosing. This was an old Nostraman gang tradition. The hands of traitors and fools were tattooed red by their families to show that they were marked for death. Although he was a dead man walking, he still had labours to perform before he was allowed to die. Corswain inquired which one Sevatar was, a traitor or a fool, to which the first captain replied that he was both. With the crumbling mental state of his Primarch, Konrad Curze denounced even his own first captain, and likely only friend, of being a traitor and a fool. And in reality, was he wrong? Sevatar was a traitor to his emperor, and his loyalist brother Astartes, and ironically, he was a fool, because he followed his Primarch, Konrad Curze. When next the 2 legions fought, the Dark Angels executed a meticulously planned ambush upon the Night Lord's fleet, whilst it was in transit across the subsector. This saw the Night Lord's Legion broken, and their Primarch mortally wounded after having faced his own brother, Lionel Johnson. Decimated in the ambush, the Night Lords under Sevatar scrambled to create a resistance to the Dark Angels and rescue their Primarch. It was now that Sevatar knew that they had little chance of finding their Primarch in the bowels of the Dark Angel ships, so he reluctantly used his shameful power that he had kept hidden. He reached out psychically to the Primarch, linking his mind in an attempt to bring him to battle and join the remnants of the Legion. It was in this moment that Sevatar, inside the mind of his own Primarch, that he unleashes his true thoughts and feelings that he had bottled up for more than a century. He chastised Konrad, as he only gave excuses for committing heinous deeds in the name of his just utopian future, whilst his brothers never had to resort to such tactics to achieve the same goals. He butchered and tortured people into compliance because it was the easy way, not the long, hard road of peaceful means. Sevatar knew what he was, a monster raised in the ways of the cruel 8th Legion, who may have thought that all this evil was part of a necessary, better future. But that was a lie. It was either for a future of an uncaring emperor on both sides, and all he had left was the Night Lord's Legion, a loose band of traitors and fools. Rousing his Primarch with his controversial words, Sevatar and a splintered Night Lord's force made an ambush upon the Dark Angel's flagship. However, there had come a cost for Sevatar using his repressed abilities, as they began to go out of control, ending up with him losing consciousness. Later, Sevatar is found imprisoned aboard the Invincible Reason. Upon awakening, he is in terrible pain from his psychic talent, and he believes that he is dying. During his imprisonment, Sevatar is contacted by the Astropath Alatani from the Astropathic Choir of the Invincible Reason, who seeks him out to ease his pain and stop his psychic talent from killing him. With his mind and body tearing apart in the confinement, I believe that he reflected on all that he had endured. From this difficult early life on Nostromo, where he has struggled to connect due to his repressed psychic abilities, to joining a legion of demigods and finding the only bond he had ever had with his Primarch, to enduring his Primarch's teachings of fear and brutality in the name of justice, which had desensitized him so much that he even aided in the destruction of his homeworld, Nostromo. He had developed a personality of sarcasm and savagery to cope with all this darkness, but in reality, I think he would have given it all up for connection and purpose. As Sevatar is putting his mind back together with the aid of the Astropath, this girl warned him that they had been discovered. And the young girl was beaten until her spine was broken by the master of the choir. An innocent person had shown him kindness and connection and was unjustly hurt. Enraged, Sevatar managed to escape his custody as the Alatani takes control of the 12 Dark Angels escorting him. Sevatar made his way to the Astropathic Choir quarters and methodically killed the master of the choir, bellowing out for all to hear, "I am justice, I am judgment, I am punishment." I believe it dawned on him that he was born to punish the cruel and put fear in the hearts of people who harmed innocents. His psychic powers came under his control, and he was filled with a new sense of cold purpose that he had admitted had eluded him for decades. Perhaps never a noble and honourable man, but there was something that he could be, a weapon of justice and punishment. He was no traitor or fool. He was Iargo Sevatarian, the Prince of Crows.